Quick, what do you know about the Apostle Paul? His name was Saul. He was a Roman citizen. He studied under the great Rabbi Gamaliel. He preached in synagogues before turning to the Gentiles. What if I told you that Paul himself never says any of those things? Every single one of those claims comes from a source other than Paul. So where do all these claims come from? To answer that, we need to understand the sources. 13 letters in the New Testament bear Paul's name, but scholars don't treat them equally. They fall into 3 tiers. The top tier, 7 letters, almost all scholars agree. Paul wrote himself. Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and Philemon. And these are our primary evidence. The middle tier, 3 disputed letters, 2nd Thessalonians, Colossians, and Ephesians. Scholarly opinion is divided on whether Paul wrote these. The bottom tier, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus, the Pastoral Epistles, named because they address how to pastor churches. Most scholars agree Paul did not write these. They likely date to the 2nd century. And then there's the book of Acts, written by someone else entirely, traditionally Luke, decades after Paul's ministry. That's a separate source with its own perspective. Here's the key methodological principle. When these sources conflict, and they do, scholars prioritize Paul's own undisputed letters. The reasoning is straightforward. Paul is the eyewitness to his own life. He wrote these letters to real communities dealing with real problems. Acts, by contrast, was written by someone who was not Paul, likely decades after the events it describes, and it has its own theological agenda shaping the narrative. This is standard historical methodology. A first-hand account written close to the events carries more weight than a second-hand account written later. And that doesn't mean we throw Acts away. It means we read it critically, aware of its limitations. And let's see what this looks like in practice. The clearest example, what happened after Paul's conversion? In Galatians chapter 1, Paul tells us himself. He went to Arabia, then returned to Damascus. 3 full years passed before he went to Jerusalem. And when he got there, he met only 2 people, Peter and James. He emphasizes this under oath. The churches in Judea did not even know his face. It was a brief private visit. Now compare that with Acts. In Acts, Paul goes to Jerusalem quickly after his conversion. Barnabas introduces him to all the apostles. He begins preaching boldly and publicly in Jerusalem. The contradictions are specific. Paul says the Judean churches didn't know his face. Acts says he was preaching boldly in Jerusalem. Paul describes a brief private visit. Acts describes active public ministry. These are minor differences in emphasis. They're incompatible accounts of the same events. And this is precisely why the source hierarchy matters. Paul was there. He's telling us what happened. When his account conflicts with a later narrative, his account takes priority. Now that we know which letters are Paul's, let's look at what Paul says about himself. In Philippians chapter 3, Paul gives us a remarkable autobiographical statement. He writes, "Circumcised on the 8th day of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew born of Hebrews, as to the law a Pharisee, as to zeal a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness under the law, blameless." Every phrase matters. Circumcised on the 8th day means he was born Jewish, not a later convert. He knew his tribal lineage, Benjamin. Both parents were Jewish, a Hebrew born of Hebrews. Now the surprises. Paul calls himself a Pharisee, a member of a Jewish movement focused on Torah interpretation and observance. Notice he never says former Pharisee. This makes Paul the only Pharisee writing before 70 CE, before the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, whose own words survive. And that final phrase, as to righteousness under the law, blameless. Blameless, Paul says he kept the law successfully. This directly contradicts a centuries-old reading. especially influential since Martin Luther, that Paul was a man tormented by guilt, crushed by his inability to follow the law. Paul says the opposite. He was righteous under the law, and he knew it. That's Paul in his own words. Now let's look at the claims that come only from Acts. The name Saul. Acts says Paul was originally called Saul. Paul never calls himself Saul, always Paulos in Greek. Roman citizenship. Acts says Paul was a citizen from birth. Paul never mentions it. Education under Gamaliel. Acts places Paul at the feet of a famous rabbi in Jerusalem. Paul never mentions Gamaliel or any formal education in Jerusalem, Hebrew fluency. Acts shows Paul addressing crowds in Hebrew. Paul writes only in Greek and never indicates he spoke Hebrew. The synagogue first missionary strategy. Acts shows Paul preaching in synagogues first, then turning to Gentiles after rejection. Paul describes himself as apostle to the Gentiles. He doesn't describe this synagogue first pattern. That pattern fits Luke's theology, to the Jew first, then the Gentile, more than it fits Paul's own account. Now, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Paul might have been a Roman citizen. He might have studied under Gamaliel, but these claims cannot be independently confirmed. So how should we handle all of this? Here's a practical framework. When you encounter a claim about Paul, ask 3 questions. Right? First, does Paul himself say this in his 7 undisputed letters? If yes, you have strong evidence. If no, ask where the claim comes from. A disputed letter? Use moderate caution. Acts? Use greater caution. It's a secondary source with theological purposes. The Pastoral Epistles? High caution. Most scholars consider them pseudepigraphal, meaning written under a false name, a common and accepted practice in the ancient world. Third question, for any non-Pauline source, does it contradict Paul's own letters? If yes, prioritize Paul's account. If no, the claim is possible but unconfirmed. Note the source. And always ask, what theological agenda might shape this source? This isn't about dismissing Acts or the disputed letters. It's about reading with precision and knowing the evidentiary weight behind each claim. The historical Paul is both more elusive and more interesting than the composite figure we've inherited from blending all sources together uncritically. In the next video, we'll look at what Paul's undisputed letters tell us about his theology and why it's more radical than you might think.